people, my name is Ray Spatz.
I'm Olivia Uskert.
And we're doing philosophy in the Hunger Games Trilogy.
Okay, so to start, I figured we'd just go over the different philosophies and philosophers we're going to be talking about.
Yep.
So obviously, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes focuses primarily on Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, with a big emphasis on social contract. So Hobbes' theory of social contract is like people are intrinsically violent. Without government, there would just be a state of chaos, so people must surrender their rights to an absolute government in order to maintain societal control. And then Locke and Rousseau kind of take a different approach. Locke is like, we all have inalienable rights, life, liberty, property. The government should exist to protect those rights. And if the government doesn't, then the people have a right to revolt. And Rousseau kind of goes along with like a similar idea of it's a two-way contract, so if the government doesn't fulfill it, then the people have to revolt. But his idea of social contract is more like communal freedom, so like you're ceding your independence for political liberty rather than like individual freedoms.
Which is really funny that the one who's like, the whole world should be ruled by this one power is the one who lived his life as like a social outcast.
Yeah. And then also under Locke I have the idea of tabula rasa, which isn't so much explicitly like talked about in Ballad, but it's just the idea that like everyone's born from a blank slate, which their ideas and experiences shape who they are.
Yeah, which makes sense because Locke is the only one out of the three that doesn't have like theory about humans being born a certain way.
Yeah. And then Sunrise obviously is a lot more explicit in how Collins chose to talk about philosophies. I decided to focus on primarily Hume and Orwell. Hume talks a lot about implicit submission and the idea that the government is made up of so few people, and like why does like such a massive population decide to submit to the will of like the few in governance,
especially like time and time again as we see in history.
And then also his idea of inductive reasoning with the sunrise, like the sun has always risen, but we can't just rely on our understanding of the past to inform what's going to happen in the future. And then that's talked about in Sunrise with like the sunrise being a metaphor for the Hunger Games and like the reapings and everything.
Which Hamish has a hard time thinking about, like, well, the reaping's on my birthday every year, so the reaping will always be on my birthday. And Lenore Dove is like, excuse me, no.
Yeah. And then Orwell isn't so much of like a traditional philosopher, but obviously
1984 is iconic.
Yeah, and Collins ties in his ideas of like propaganda as a form of psychological warfare and using it to control people's language and the history to kind of shape. I think that kind of ties in well to implicit submission because it can shape how like a tyrannical government is able to keep such a massive population under control. And then also that kind of ties in the idea of painting posters in Sunrise with Hamish and Maisley and all of them kind of making their own form of propaganda against the Capitol, which I think is an interesting twist on it.
Yeah.
So then I figured we'd kind of just, because philosophy is so emphasized in the first two books, thought it would be interesting to kind of go back and see how that philosophy, if it's evident in the original trilogy.
Or if it's something that kind of got added in just for the like new prequels.
Yeah.
I'd say it's interesting because like it is so not heavy-handed, but it is so apparent in the prequels that each character kind of ties to a certain idea.
Yeah.
So character-based analysis in the trilogy could maybe see if this was something that was always on the forefront, or was it more idea-based and now we're going back to solidify what the ideas were.
Yeah, and kind of going back through the original trilogy, I think it's kind of interesting for the characters that were tied to a specific philosophy in the prequels. They kind of stayed consistent with that philosophy in the trilogy, but then the ones who hadn't been tied specifically to one, like Katniss, Gale, Peeta, like they all represent certain aspects of different philosophies, but it's not as clearly evident, which then is also kind of makes me think like how far ahead did Collins plan in advance for the prequels, and like did she know she was going to tie these characters to these certain philosophies? Because like I noticed when I was going through, I think it was the first book, like Hamish has a couple of moments where he's talking about like when they held Katniss and Peeta held hands in the chariot, he said just the perfect touch of rebellion, and I was like, he also said something like that during the reaping, like, kind of taunting, like, the camera people, whatever. Just kind of that continuous idea of, like, propaganda, painting posters, like, not... Also, in that case.
Also with him on Sunrise on the Reaping being like, I need to be a rascal, not a rebel. So he's like incorporating that mindset that we see in Sunrise on the Reaping, but that was present even in the first book.
Yeah, and so it was, I don't know, it was just interesting to see how that was like present in the original trilogy. And I also noticed, I think one of my like theories, because most of like the philosophy stuff that was present in the prequels, I saw primarily in the first book through like the idea of propaganda and painting posters, and not so much the social contract stuff.
Yeah.
And I was kind of thinking of how like Katniss is our narrator in the trilogy, and obviously her identity is tied a lot to survival, and so she doesn't really, I guess, have the luxury of thinking of those like big philosophical ideas of social contract. Like she's just focused on getting through each individual day, and so it was hard to see explicit examples of those philosophies being present because they're not tied to specific characters in the trilogy where they are in the prequels.
Which ties greatly into, like, what Katniss was focused on and what philosophy she was on, or she did exhibit.
I know we kind of talked about a little bit about, like, the inductive, deductive reasoning and how, you know, she eventually becomes the Mockingjay and, like, challenges the Capitol's authority, kind of moving into the later, like, the second and third novels in the trilogy. But I noticed that when she kind of subscribed to the ideas of social contract and revolting if your government like doesn't protect your liberties, she had those moments specifically when someone she loved was affected by the Capitol's tyranny. So like when Rue died in the games, she had a moment where she was like, I have to fight the Capitol. Like, I don't remember what the specific passage was, but she was like explicitly stating that she wanted to rebel against the Capitol. And then in Mockingjay, when she sees Peeta on like his first broadcast with Caesar, and like right after that she's like, I'm gonna be the Mockingjay,
to which she like, it's the first time we see her pull herself together in the whole book, is like, okay, they're hurting Peeta, I gotta lock in and get my stuff done. Which, yeah, her implicit submission gets kind of overruled because it's so directly tied to her family and the people she cares about. So she'll be submissive if it means her people are taken care of, but the moment her people are not taken care of, she breaks out of that submission.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot in Catching Fire at the beginning when she was, like, doing the victory tour, and Snow talked to her and was like, you know, you have to convince me that this wasn't an act of rebellion, whatever, so she followed, like, did everything that she thought would please Snow. And then, like, I remember writing about, like, she adjusts her behavior to please Snow in the Capitol, like, fitting directly into that implicit submission because her greatest fear is losing the people she loves. And then once the threat, she realizes what she does will have no impact really on keeping them safe.
She basically throws it to the wind.
Exactly. And I thought it was interesting because Gale, for example, obviously he cares about his family, but he I feel like, has always had this idea of rebelling against the Capitol and recognizing that they don't protect the districts. But that's kind of been consistent throughout his worldview. Whereas Katniss really only has those moments when the people that she loves are affected. And I thought that was very interesting.
I'd say the biggest difference is, because we kind of went over, like, the theory of values and the, like, 9 main values that people can have. And one of the things that we assigned Gale was, like, that sense of achievement that Katniss doesn't have. Where Gale is very motivated by, like, personal success and, like, his own competence, which is probably why we see that difference, because Katniss is a lot more driven in security, where Gale has that sense of achievement that he needs.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you included Prim in the list of characters for philosophies. Could you, you put her as Rousseau?
Yeah, kind of just, I feel like she definitely isn't as explicit about rebelling against the Capitol, but I feel like she has this sense of, like, protecting people and, like, wanting, because, like, she's a healer, like her mom, and I know, like, in the Mockingjay, she has conversations with Katniss about becoming the Mockingjay, and so even though it isn't as explicit, I think she does recognize that obviously the capital is tyrannical, and I also talked about, there's a passage I think in Mockingjay, when Katniss realizes that Prim has like grown up so much, and kind of like the idea of tabula rasa, like she's been shaped so much by like the violence and brutality of District 12 and the capital, that I think even though she doesn't necessarily stand out as a figure of rebellion, she still like does her part against the capital to not adhere to their like tyrannical system, and also kind of encourages Katniss to rebel against the capital. Yeah, I guess, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's also because like she's a medic like her mom, and her mom once said like you kind of have to have the mindset for it, or like the ability to do it, and Katniss is like, well, it never came naturally to me, and Prim is just instantly like always in that role of helping people, of being able to be in that room healing others, giving everything she can to her demise.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting, the dichotomy of like Gale attempts to fulfill the social contract by like violently rebelling against the capital, whereas Prim takes a more like healer's approach, and obviously Gale survives and Prim doesn't. But then also their legacies. Yeah. Obviously, in the end, Katniss is like, I never want to talk to Gale ever again. But then, like, everyone remembers Prim as this, like, amazing person to be around, helping everyone. And so I think that's kind of a little bit similar to in Ballad, when Collins uses, like, Sejanus and Corio and Lucy Gray to kind of represent different ideas of approaching social contract and what to do when your government does overstep their boundaries. Yeah. Obviously, again, not as explicit, but still kind of an interesting connection, I thought.
Also, because going back to that values, we said that Gale has achievement. You also said that Prim has that sense of achievement that she needs too, which is very interesting. That like you brought up that they both have legacies in the same way, and they both tried to like rebel against the capital in different ways. The big difference I saw between them was that Prim is very universal, where Gale very much only cares about his in-group.
Yeah, and I feel like that kind of plays in a little bit to the idea, like, Rousseau is more oriented to, like, communal values and the government protecting, like, community, versus Locke is more, like, protecting individual rights, which I think Gale was probably more for, whereas Prim kind of, you know, she cared about everybody, she wanted everyone to be, like, protected and have those communal rights. So I feel like that's kind of where the differing philosophies come in.
Yeah. Speaking of characters who are very similar, very aptly same sides of the same coin, we have Snow as very Hobbesian. He was very Hobbesian in Ballad. But then breaking down Coin's values, we had Coin as like literally the exact same beat for beat. Everything Snow did, Coin did too.
Yeah. She's interesting because she kind of pretends to hold like the ideas of Locke and Rousseau, and I guess pretending, or like she wants to overthrow the capital, but not because she wants to protect the people's side of the social contract. She wants to overthrow the government so that she can become that tyrannical government.
She can be the Leviathan, basically.
Yeah, which I find, I don't know, the fact that the two sides of the rebellion are led by essentially the same kind of person is... Yeah.
Like, not even just in, like, actions, but in their values and what they choose to believe is the exact same.
Yeah, like, looking back through Mockingjay, I, like, the section where Coin, like, punished the prep team and, like, held them in this cell. Katniss, like, there's a quote where Katniss says it's a warning about, quote, who's really in control and what happens if she's not obeyed. And it's like, that's exactly what Snow did with, like, Cinna and Darius and literally everyone.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy-handed. That's like, this is not a good person. This is the exact same person as Snow. And it's also like it's about who's really in control and what happens if she's not obeyed. I'm pretty sure Katniss had a very, very similar line when Snow gave her the same demands about, like, in the Victory Tour of, like, don't be rebellious, don't spark anything more, here's a warning if I'm not obeyed. And then she's like, okay, I'm on the rebel side now, and then the Coin does literally beat for beat the same thing.
Yeah, like, shape it, like, Katniss, you have to fit this exact narrative that we're laying out, like, you have to listen to what we're doing or else, like, even when Katniss had her list of demands, after she read it, Coin basically said, but if you don't fulfill our end of this promise, then you're done. Yeah. You're out of here.
She was much less concerned about Katniss's representing of the people and her getting the Leviathan.
Yeah, and then also the ideas of like, during the rebellion, the Capitol has their propaganda, the rebels also have their propaganda, and obviously the rebels' propaganda is more sympathetic because they're like, we don't want the Capitol killing the districts anymore. But I think it is interesting how Coin attempted to script the propos the same way that the Capitol scripts their propaganda. And also, just, I don't know, there's too many similarities between the structure of the Capitol and then District 13.
Which, this might be a little off topic, but it's kind of occurring to me, like, right now that, like, Mockingjay, Katniss, and Peeta are consistently in that parallel. Where everything that's happening to Katniss is likely also happening to Peeta with Snow. Because they're both being made to do the propos. They're both being made to do these scripted reviews of, like, what's going on in the war, and neither of them are fully true. The only difference is Katniss is still getting drugged within an inch of her life, but the only difference is that one is on the rebel side and one is on the Capitol side.
Yeah, and Peeta's obviously sustaining more physical torture, but Katniss is being still, like, psychologically tortured in a way. Yeah, I never really thought about that, how they were essentially experiencing the same things.
Yeah, and then it's like, oh, well, we get to be safe now. No. We have to deal with the issues now.
Yeah.
Speaking of Peeta, we actually haven't gone over who he does for philosophy.
We kind of have, like, either Rousseau or Locke.
Yeah, he was one of the harder ones. So, the values we broke down for him were self-direction, independent thought, and action. I put that down entirely because of the one conversation in Hunger Games where he's like, I don't want them to change who I am.
Yeah.
He's, like, one of the very few people who actually had a very independent thought and action outside of everybody else and expresses it. He still has the security, though. Still is from District 12. He still wants to survive. He still got put in the Hunger Games.
Yeah.
Made him really appreciate the basic necessities. He's also one of the characters that has universalism. So, rather than that individual, he's very focused on the community, like you said, with Prim and Rousseau.
Yeah.
So, I could see it going both ways.
Yeah. I feel like it's hard to place because obviously these characters aren't directly tied to each of the philosophies.
Yeah.
He's definitely not Hobbesian.
Oh, no.
We know that for sure. But he's somewhere on the spectrum of, like, obviously the government should protect the people. I could honestly see him holding both perspectives, kind of like you said, of, like, obviously protecting individual rights, but then also he's less extreme than Gale and kind of more towards Prim in the area of, like, protecting communal rights as well.
I also feel like he's a lot less tabula rasa. What is it? Tabula rasa?
Tabula rasa.
Tabula rasa, thank you. I cannot pronounce it to save my life. Not good for the Hunger Games. I think he also is less of tabula rasa and a lot more of everyone is born good. I think he is one of the characters, like with Prim, who sees the innate good in people.
Yeah.
Which, I agree with you, I think he holds the Locke values, but the Rousseau belief on humanity.
Yeah, I like that description of it, because I feel like Peeta and Prim, as you said, hold the idea that, like, everyone is born good. I feel like Gale and Katniss probably hold the more tabula rasa idea that, like, people are good or bad kind of shaped on their experiences, and then
I feel like Katniss has a lot more of a gray area in that, though, and Gale is very black and white.
That's true. I feel like Gale still kind of has that tabula rasa idea, but then once people do one action that situates them as either good or bad, like, he cements himself to that idea and won't change it. Whereas Katniss kind of recognizes that there's not necessarily one evil and one good, and there's a lot of moral gray area in between. So I feel like she's a lot more flexible on her idea of tabula rasa.
Which, it's really fun that all the good characters are on the side of, like, moral flexibility, and you gotta understand everyone, when, like, the rules of morality are, like, they're impartial, they're divisive, they're alienating, they're committed to providing rules, and the entirety of our cast, except for maybe Gale, Snow, and Coin, is like, oh, but you gotta have the gray area, and it's like, the definition of morality is to not have that gray area.
Yeah, can't remember, I've probably had these conversations in, like, class thing, but, like, the idea that there isn't necessarily, like, one definitive evil or one definitive good, that, like, people kind of lie somewhere on the spectrum, and obviously there are things that are, like, more evil than others, like, Snow is more evil than Prim, But I think Collins maybe kind of wanted to portray a bit the idea of not cementing, like, one unchanging view of people. Like, I feel like she kind of highlights that between Katniss and Gale. Like, for example, when they're talking about Katniss's prep team, there was one moment, it might have been in Catching Fire, or, like, there's a moment, it was, when she says, I feel bad about how I go around feeling so superior to them, in reference to her prep team. Who knows who I would be, or what I would talk about if I had been raised in the Capitol. Maybe my biggest regret would have been having feathered costumes at my birthday party, too. So she, like, really dives into the idea of tabula rasa there, and then later in the Mockingjay, Gale's like, why do you care about your prep team? Like, why do you feel bad for them?
They're Capitol. They've cemented themselves in the bad.
Exactly. And he kind of plays into the idea, without realizing it, of the Capitol dividing the districts into, like, subgroups and cementing, like, all district people against all Capitol people. And he's kind of feeding into the mindset that the Capitol wants him to fall into, like, not being able to unite with everyone to rebel against the Capitol.
Which plays back into his very big, I'm only for my in-group and for nobody else. The districts are his in-group, and he's just like, no, I cannot sympathize with anyone Capitol.
Which I feel like if you're trying to form a non-tyrannical government, that's not a trait you should necessarily have.
D1 Gale hater. Which is also fun because he has, like, Gale is the only one with hedonism, I put, which is very interesting for me because I feel like I would have wanted to put that with Snow.
Yeah.
But Gale, so hedonism is defined as pleasure or sensuous gratification for oneself. And I feel like the way Gale goes about getting his achievements is very hedonistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Especially regarding to Katniss.
Because Snow, I feel like, yes, he does seek things for himself, but I feel like it's also more about, like, his legacy and, like, maintaining the Snow name, which obviously, like, is related
it's his value his value of power, control, dominance over people and resources.
That's interesting.
Because Gale doesn't have that power.
Yeah.
Gale doesn't have the power, he doesn't have that belief in tradition, he doesn't like conformity at all, but yet he still, like, wants things for himself in a way that we don't really see in other characters, where he's like, I want this, I'm gonna do anything to get it because I believe that this is what I deserve and what I, like, should get.
Yeah. Ugh,
Which,
I like him.
Yeah. D1 Gale haters in this room only. But it's interesting that it's the one of the district characters that has hedonism, considering hedonistic culture is so implicitly tied into the Capitol.
Yeah. We kind of touched on this earlier, but when, like, Katniss's implicit submission or lack thereof, and kind of how in the first book her ideas, like painting posters when she, like, shot the apple, like, out of the pig's mouth during her, like, training when they score, what's that called, where they, like, their evaluation or whatever.
The training evaluations.
Yeah. That was kind of like, she was painting a poster, but I wrote, like, as a note that she wasn't really rebelling against the Capitol as an institution at that point, just about, like, specific people there that weren't paying respect to her. And I think it's interesting watching throughout the trilogy how it kind of starts out as just more personal, but then it eventually grows into her painting those posters against the Capitol as an institution rather than just the specific people that are disrespecting her or causing harm to her.
Which does show that she does have that underlying want to disobey, and the underlying want to, like, not just be under the Capitol's foot, but she needs, like, the push to get there.
Yeah, and I think also because her identity is tied so much to protecting her family and loved ones, she's willing to push the, like, ideas of the Capitol not fulfilling the social contract aside and give into implicit submission if it means protecting her family.
Yeah. Which is also something we see with Haymitch towards the end of Sunrise on the Reaping, where he's like, wait, I didn't think I was actually going to get it out of the arena alive. And then he immediately starts playing lapdog. He's like, I'm just gonna be everyone's favorite for the rest of eternity, and just, like, hopefully that saves everyone I love. It doesn't.
Yeah.
But.
And it kind of, I mean, it would make sense if this were true, but, like, if implicit submission is more common or more, like, heavily enforced, I guess, in those, like, tyrannical Hobbesian governments where, like, obviously implicit submission exists if there's a government at all, but then I feel like there's kind of different levels of implicit submission where, like, the district's submitting to having the Hunger Games happen versus in a democracy where people pay their taxes. Like, there's different levels of it, I feel like.
Yeah, because, like, if we're to compare it to the real world and probably what Hume was referring to, it's like we have these representative democracies where we voluntarily give over power to these people we vote for, and we submit to them because they're the government. They're supposed to keep us safe, and it's just kind of something that we do, versus there's no representation in PNM, there's no accountability, there's no say, and so there is an implicit submission more so because every part of their life is submission, and there is no way for them to provide voice.
Yeah, and so that kind of makes me wonder, like, at what point do we get to where we have a government, and, like, again, implicit submission is always going to exist if there is a government, but, like, to what point do we get to where it's, like, the implicit submission isn't really, I guess, submitting anymore? I don't know if that makes any sense.
No,
but, like,
I understand what you're getting at. It's like, at what point is it not, like, a choice to submit, but rather you do it because that's what's expected and that is what you do to survive, basically.
Yeah, because, like, in Sunrise, obviously, Plutarch is like, why do you submit to it all, Haymitch? But then once we get to, like, the epilogue of the Mockingjay after the rebellion, I assume, like, there's some sort of government that exists. It's a different government, but there's still technically implicit submission there because people are allowing that government to exist. But there's not that much of a challenge to that implicit submission, I guess, because I assume there's, like, not that much, like, state-sponsored violence that's happening at that point.
I believe that. I think for your question on, like, what's the tipping point, I think it's when people's survival or basic needs are in the hands of the tyrannical government, because then it's not a choice to submit, it becomes tied with your necessity to submit. I wouldn't call that implicit submission, I would call that being forced to do what you have to do to survive.
Yeah.
Which also brings a really good point, because these philosophies are made for our world, and a lot of these philosophers were men in privileged society who were allowed to spend copious amounts of time to sit and think about this and develop theories and rules, versus being put into context of, like, the real world and people who don't have time to sit and think and choose.
Yeah, and then also implicit submission, like, obviously, if there's a tyrannical government, like, we want there to be some kind of change, but the reason why that implicit submission exists is, I don't even know, like, it's not really that implicit to me. I feel like people know that they're submitting to the government's rule in those, like, situations where the government is tyrannical, but they're doing it explicitly. Like, they're doing it on purpose because they know they have to protect themselves to survive. And I feel like that's kind of not one of, like, my grievances with the idea, but, like, I feel like a lot of times when Hume is talking about the idea of implicit submission, to me, it's not very implicit. Like, implicit submission to me is, like, existing under a democracy and, like, having those people rule. More of a tyrannical government where the government is violating that social contract. I feel like people, like, they know that they're submitting. They know that they're doing it, and I don't know how implicit it actually is.
I mean, I would disagree. I would say it's a lot more explicit if you are making the choice to submit to the government, because we have, like, if we're applying it to our world, technically I could go out tomorrow and say, I'm never gonna vote. There's actually a phenomenon called the sovereign citizens rule, where there are people who believe they're, like, sovereign citizens of the U.S., where they live in the U.S., but laws don't apply to them because they don't submit to the government. Not exactly true. There's a lot wrong with that. But by that logic, they're not implicitly submitting. It's not something that they're expected to do, and they've broken away from that. But the implicit submission is more of a, this is what we're expected to do because we have these rights in the government. I'd say that's pretty similar to what everyone in PNM is born into, not in the level of violence, but rather in the level of expectation to uphold.
Yeah.
Like, you're supposed to uphold your district. You're supposed to uphold keeping your family together and listening to the government because that is the world you were born into.
Mm-hmm.
So very similar with our democracy. We're expected to, like, just keep the democracy going because that's the world we're born into.
Yeah, I see that.
I think it is an interesting point, though, to, like, when does it become implicit submission versus what would explicit submission be?
Yeah, because I was kind of trying to do, like, a little bit of digging into that, but it wasn't really resulting in anything fruitful in my, like, 15 minutes of looking, but...
Mountain of time in our hands at finals week.
Yeah. So that wraps up our discussion of philosophy in the Hunger Games for today. I'm Olivia Uskert.
My name is Ray Spatz.
And we'll see you guys next week.